Hey everybody, so this is going to be the first introduction demo in InDesign itself, not specifically about portfolio organization, but just how to use InDesign, the software. So as I mentioned before, this is my portfolio. I will be using this for the example in this case. The very first thing you need to think about in InDesign is actually what size you want your portfolio to be. Now I know many of you probably have portfolios you've made in the past. I would strongly recommend making a fresh one this time around, as it's going to be significantly better than trying to recreate or work with something you've already started. So to begin with, I just hit new, do a new document. I'm going to switch from picas to inches because I understand inches and I don't quite understand picas very well. I can think in inches and that helps me. Next, of course, is going to be orientation, and then we have to decide whether we want to do facing pages. Now, this is something I talked about in one of the last videos, but essentially a facing page is whether or not you want to have two pages, like a book, or you want it to be just a single page that you view, and then the next single page, and the next single page. So that's really what facing pages is, and it's something you should probably decide early on. Again, if you're going to print, facing pages is probably something you want to have. If printing is not a big concern for you, or if you're only going to be digital, a single page can be fine. Issue works very well with either, but it does work pretty well with facing pages because it has that sort of crease in the center, so it allows it to work pretty nicely. The next thing to consider is the actual size. You by no means have to stick to 8.5 by 11 or any conventional size. In fact, if you are going to get a PDF professionally printed, and I don't mean Kinko's, but an actual professional print company. Kinko's is fine or whatever for something basic, but for an actual professional print company, they prefer sizes that are not the standard 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 17, because a typical print company will actually need to trim the page down. So they might start with an 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 17, but by the time they trim it to get everything to be perfectly aligned, they don't have that much page left. So they actually prefer odd sizes. Now, my logic has always been you should be considering a screen first and foremost. Now, a screen isn't necessarily an exact number of inches left to right. Every screen that everyone's going to view on is a different number of inches. However, 90% of screens are the same ratio of height to width, which is 16 by 9. So that's why I typically work with, if I was to do a single page, I would do a width of 16 and a height of 9. Because I know that when that image is fully open, it will fill the screen completely and there won't be black space around on edges, not black bars on the top, not black bars on the side. It'll just be the portfolio. It'll fit most screens the best. So that's why I work with that size. Now, if you were doing facing pages, you wouldn't want that because that would be too next to each other. In fact, it's something I really advise against is having two landscape images next to each other in facing pages, because then you get enormous black bars to the top and bottom when the thing is spread out and you're very far zoomed out. So in that case, and actually the ratio that I use in my personal portfolio is where each portfolio page has 8 inches of width and 9 inches of height, because two of those next to each other will be 16 by 9. So you end up with the same ratio. It fits the screens very nicely. You can put in a number of pages. I would just start with, say, 15. Doesn't matter too much. You can always add more, so that's not really a problem. There are default gutters and columns. I would just ignore those for now. There are margins. That's just sort of a pink line that's around the outside. That can be a useful thing to keep in mind. Their margins really exist for a couple reasons. One, they could be that sort of compositional reason of wanting to leave white space at the edge of your page, in which case the exact margin that you use will be up to you. The other reason is pretty much every printer that exists cannot print edge to edge. So if you did want to print on something, unless you're going to a professional print company that's then going to cut your page down, you can't have full edge to edge printing. So you need to have a margin so that the printer can stop printing and leave some white space. For most printers, that's typically 1/4 inch, so I would leave the margins at 0.25 in that case. Again, these don't actually show up. They're just guides. They won't make any effect on the decisions you make when actually laying out your portfolio, but they are useful guides to have. There's also what I call bleeds and slug. We're not going to go in these. These are specific things for working with, again, the professional print companies that are beyond Kinko's. When you actually want to send it out to get this thing professionally bound as a book, you'll have to consider these things. But I'm not going to talk about them now. They're not something you need to know. They are totally unnecessary. My PDF portfolio is set up with them, but that's because it is set up to print as a print document, but they're really unnecessary. When you are applying to grad school, there may be some grad schools that still require physical copies. They mostly do not exist anymore. Pretty much every school that I know of has gone fully digital, but there is a chance that some grad school out there still requires physical copies. And I have heard of at least one co-op employer that requires a physical copy, and it is simply a tactic that they use to weed out people who aren't dedicated or fully interested in that job, because it is a lot of extra work to make a physical copy, and you have to mail it into them as a package. So, but that's a firm that's probably also worth it. So, of course, name this something that makes sense, and that will be the start of your portfolio. So looks like when I set this thing up, I didn't set up facing pages. If I wanted to change that, I could always go down to Document Setup at any time, and I could click on Facing Pages. Facing pages is always going to start with one page by itself as a default, and then two pages next to each other, as you can see here. And that's just because that would be your cover page. So for this demo, this is how I'm going to show things. Again, my preference is to use facing pages, but it's not necessary. But you can see here that we have a nice sort of ratio of 16:9. So I'm going to hit Shift W, which will go full screen. It takes up my full screen because it was designed to do so. The next thing I'm going to talk about is, so one thing, if your InDesign looks different than mine, I am using the workspace called Essentials Classic because that's what I learned on, and that's what I'm familiar with. If you want yours to look the same, yours may be, I don't know what the default is these days. It might just be Essentials, so it might look a little different, something like this. But switching between workspaces can get you to make your page look exactly like mine if you want to follow along the way I've done things. Anyways, so on this side of the screen, there should be your sort of pages, layers, and links tab. So layers works similar to how Photoshop does. Layers are a good thing to use. They're not 100% necessary in InDesign, but they are a good thing to use. Typically, the layers I would have in a InDesign file are going to be, say, background, images, and text. Not terribly advanced, but basically just whenever I'm adding text to a portfolio, I would try to put on that layer. Whenever I am adding images, I try to put on that layer, and if anything needs to be in the background, it'll be on that layer. The real reason being is just you can control them, so you can turn them all off and on, or lock them so that maybe you're editing the text and you don't want to have to accidentally drag around images. So that's why doing this can be useful. Any layer you click on is the layer you're actively working on, so anything you do will end up on that layer. So if I start creating text, it's going to be on whatever layer I'm working on, even though that top layer is named text right now. Next, you have a links panel. Currently has nothing in it. I'll show you in my file what that looks like, but these are essentially all the things that are linked into your InDesign. So unlike Photoshop, typically, and unlike Illustrator typically, when you bring something into InDesign, it actually doesn't live in InDesign. It is just a reference, a link to a file that exists somewhere on your computer. So it is very good and actually 100% necessary to keep organized a file structure on your computer itself. So this is just from assignment 3, all the things I had put together that I was going to include as part of the demo. Not the most amazing file structure in the world, but if I were to, say, grab this person here, throw them into InDesign, there they are. I just hit E, which allows me to use the scaling tool. So if I put them right there, they don't exist in InDesign. this is just a proxy for them. At the time of exporting, it'll bring in the actual files and use them to output an image that includes those people. However, if I were to delete this file that exists in my file structure or move it, InDesign won't know what to reference anymore, and will only have a thumbnail image of this, which means extremely low quality, which will not look good. So once you start placing things in InDesign, you really don't want to move them. So the best thing you can do is create a file structure where you can keep things and keep things organized. So that would be, naming things by studio, putting them where they should be. You can bring any sort of image into InDesign. So that was a PNG. I could bring in, for example, my Photoshop file. And it's actually not inherently a bad idea to bring in a Photoshop file, because InDesign will export it and will be able to compress it down to whatever quality it needs to be. You can see here that that was placed on top of my other image. If I want to fix that, I could go to Arrange, bring that guy to front. So now they are standing in front of, put them right in front of her. Look at that. They actually look kind of like they're meant to be a part of that composition. However, if they were on different layers, so they're both, all of these things are on the background layer. You can see that they have a blue border to these images. If I were to bring, let's say, bring this image, I'm going to bring it to the foreground, which I do just by dragging this little box here up. So now that image is on the images layer. Because they are on the background layer, no matter what I do, even if I tell them to bring to front, which I can't do because they're already in front of the layer, they will forever be behind that. The stacking in layers is entirely rigid. Nothing, it moves vertically. Nothing below here can ever be above something that is above it in the stack that exists here. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind if you can't figure out why an image isn't where it should be. And again, anything you have selected, you can just drag the box on the right side here and move it up. So that brings those people in front. Once you have brought an image in, the default tool, this little guy here, which is the selection tool, if you start dragging the box, you'll find that it's actually not scaling the image, it's scaling the box the image is in. This is essentially cropping. And it is incredibly useful because sometimes you may not decide that you want all that sky, maybe you just want that part. But it isn't useful if you need to make the image, say, be larger to fit to your border that you have there. That's where pull this over. So I always use keyboard commands for everything in Adobe programs. The two ones you need to learn are E and V. Switch between those two of those and you can do practically everything you need to know in InDesign. E is this little guy here though. It's the free transform tool. And basically you can just drag. One thing though to keep in mind, you want to drag while holding shift. See, if I drag while not holding shift, it changes the proportions of the image and it looks terrible. So if you drag, you can drag it out to align to that line. One thing you may want to do is under view here, you can go to guides and make sure snap to guides is on. We don't actually have any guides because we just have the grids. Guides are essentially the blue bars that allow you to arrange things along them. You can make a guide just by dragging down from the top or bottom or side. Actually, it has to be top or side, where the ruler is. If you don't have a ruler, you can turn a ruler on again by going to view and extras. Nope, not extras. Oh, right here. Show rulers, high rulers, Control R, but right there. These little teal lines, essentially things can snap onto. So if you bring this image, you can snap it to that edge, and then you could snap them to that edge too. And it helps make alignments. So in general, try to align things. That's always a really good goal in a portfolio. But beyond creating these little guides, which you may want to do from time to time, they are going to be very useful for you. There are many other ways to keep things organized. So these guides only exist on this page. Now I could Control C and then Control V and paste in place and bring them to each page, but that's kind of a hassle. The next thing I can do is go to my pages box. So here I have all the pages in my portfolio, which so far I think I made, 15? One cover and a bunch of images after that. Above, you should also have something called master pages, which by default there should be just an A master. We can create a new master page just by having the master selected and pressing new. It'll create a B master. Essentially what master pages are things that are in common between all the pages. So a great example of this is, I'm going to go to my A master, and once you just double click on it, you'll be editing that master alone. You can see it's by itself in the world. Anything I put here, so if I drag out a grid and drag out another grid and let's drag out a couple more, all of these grids will exist on every page that has that master applied to it. And it's a great way to keep consistent. So if you want to make sure your text is in exactly the same place on every page, use a grid. Specifically, use a grid on a master page. Now I want to go back to that master page and say I want to divide up the composition a bit more uniformly. I'm going to go to Layout and let's go to Create Guides. And here you can set a number of rows and columns. Make sure Preview, this little checkbox is on. So I can divide up my page into 3s if I wanted to. Now, by default, it has these gutters set up, and that's just essentially 2 lines. This is useful if you wanted to put images next to each other, but you didn't want them to actually touch each other. You wanted to keep a consistent spacing. That's how you could do this. Now, personally, I find the default gutter is too much, so I actually go to the minimum gutter before it disappears, 0.25 or 0.0625. That's just my personal preference. You may aesthetically find that 0.125 or 1/8 is your preferred gutter, whatever it may be. Anything you do here, once you hit OK, will appear on the master page and will appear on every other page. My general recommendation, I like dividing a page up into 5s. I find it gives you a little bit more control. Dividing a page into 3 also works fairly well. I don't really like dividing a page into 4 because it usually puts an image directly on the center line, which to me is compositionally a little bit odd. So if you're going to use these, which I highly recommend you do, dividing a page into 3 or dividing a page into 5 are both great starting places. But you could also say divide the number of rows into 5 and a number of columns into 3. You don't have to be equal on them. I'm just going to stick with that. Now again, every one of my pages now has this applied. I also have the other ones I created, which I can just select. You notice here, I cannot select these. They are on a master page. I cannot edit them. I can if I hold a particular key combination, which I would have to remember and isn't coming to me right now. Oh, I did it. And it is, of course, different on a Mac and PC, but on a PC it seemed to be Control and Shift will allow you to make things that are on a master page editable. But in general, not something you need to do very often. The only time you might need to do that is, say, if I were making a master page where I knew every one of my projects I wanted to have a text box in the same place. Say I want to have a text box, which the text tool is here. It's also T for text. And I always want it to be right here. And let's just, I'm actually just going to copy some text from someplace else. I don't have to write something. I'll just take this text. So if I always want that text, now it's on every page. So if I go to my cover page, it's there, it's there, it's there, all these different places. If I want to just use that text box, but don't want to have to use the text in it, that's where Control Shift works. So I can make that text box editable again. And now I can put something else here. So that's very useful for, say, titles or for cover pages on a particular project. A useful little trick there. The next thing is, since I did mention you can have multiple master pages, each one of these pages in my document has a little A in the corner. That's because I have the A master applied. If I want to apply the B master, all I do is just drag the B over and apply it. So now this spread has the B master applied. If I look at the spread, it doesn't have the teal lines anymore because I don't have anything on my B master right now. There may be times where you have different master pages. Say you have a cover page of each project, something that introduced a project, that might get its own master. And then the body pages that just have all of the sort of documentation of your project might be a separate type of master. That's where those can become really useful. And again, keeping consistent between projects is always a really good idea. So that's sort of master pages, how to use them. Again, use a grid, use master pages. They will be infinitely useful for you. So if I were sort of laying out this page here, let's just say this were just a normal page, not necessarily a page of like a cover page or something. I might, again, scale this guy, get it pretty close. I'm shifting between E and V to sort of, now I'm going to use V to just crop this image. So maybe it goes there. Now, if I crop the image and I don't like the exact placement of it, if I double click, it allows me to move the image within its crop. So I could go to something like this and bring that down. So those are nicely aligned. Bring some text over here. Now maybe I want that to align like so. Sometimes you have to zoom in. And let's bring in another image just for, how about, not what I was thinking. Oh, we'll just bring this guy in. So oftentimes you realize or see when you bring an image in, it's very large. That's just because it brings in at whatever the size it was. So if it was an 11 by 17, it's going to bring in at 11 by 17 regardless of its resolution. So I might have mentioned in the Photoshop demo or one of them that keeping full bleed is often a really useful thing, meaning this image I have the black bars on. The original Photoshop file, those black bars can be turned off. I don't know where that Photoshop file is. Oh, here it is. So if I open this guy, just open Photoshop real quick. Photoshop. So I'm just going to turn that little black frame off so that the image doesn't have it anymore. I'm just going to save that. And now drag that guy in. The advantage here is that if I decide that I'm going to place this here and maybe scale it, maybe for this particular composition that I want a little bit more sky than maybe I had in some previous ones, because I haven't cropped this thing, I can now do that as part of the InDesign process. Or maybe I want to go and use the grid a little differently, so I'm going to pull it larger. And again, shifting between E and V, using, oops, did that wrong. So I'm going to hit V to make sure that I'm not actually scaling. Bring that down. And so it's the start of a page. Not super well balanced just yet, but you can see here things are already lined up, so they inherently look good. Let's move over to the portfolio. Let's talk about some text stuff. Let's find a nice text page. So here's a good example. So this is, again, the resume. You can see here that I actually have 3 different weights of text. There is this text here, which is this sort of descriptive text. I currently have it set to book. The one above, which is this sort of information, the city, and the date and time. It's currently set to light. And again, these are both Futura PT. And then Perkins and Will, Futura PT medium. I actually might prefer if this were a slightly different arrangement. Maybe if this were actually set to light. And it's good to try these things out and see which one looks best for you. That actually I like better. So I've already improved my portfolio as part of this little demonstration. But there's a nice sort of hierarchy here. You want your eye to be able to know where it should land as you move down the page. So if we look at this, I'm going to hit W. Anytime you click W, that will make the lines and text things and boxes disappear, and you can view it without. And if you hit Shift W, it goes to full page. So you can see here, as my eye runs down this page, it's easy to know Perkins and Will, Terry Bowling, GBBN, William McDonough, Ziegler Sneed, Earl Swenson, the Office of Planning and Architecture. And that's because there's sort of 3 different weights here, and one of them is inset. It makes it really clear and really easy to read as I'm moving through. Now, choosing a font is a very difficult thing to do. There's a few standard fonts that work really well. Helvetica is a great font. I'm currently using Futura in this. It can look really good to combine fonts. However, you need to make sure the fonts work well together. If you do not know how to combine fonts, find someone who does. Specifically, if you happen to have a friend in graphic design, they can help you with this problem. It is literally part of their profession. The thing they are studying is how fonts work together. That is an entire field of graphic design, is just understanding fonts. There are also websites out there where you can just Google font combinations, and it'll be things that people have posted of different fonts that they found work nicely together, and they show you what it looks like. As a general rule of thumb, I'd recommend against doing it until you know what you're doing or are copying one of these websites. The other thing is you may not have every font. Futura is not a default font on Windows. Your default fonts on Windows and Mac are going to be very different. Mac has, for example, all of the Helvetica fonts. Windows also does not have that. And that's because fonts have licenses, and Windows is not really willing to pay for those expensive licenses, while Apple products are. So Apple products have, on the Mac side at least, a variety of other fonts that Windows doesn't. There is a way around this, which is that Adobe allows you to get more fonts. If you are logged in and using the Adobe Creative Suite, which I believe probably all of you have, if you hit the Find More button. Okay, anyways, so I had trouble finding this. Apparently, actually, if you click the Get More Font button or More Font button, somehow through here you can get taken all the way to Adobe, but I couldn't figure it out. So I just Googled it and found the Adobe website, which looks like this. So basically, if you log in using your Adobe login, you have access to all of these fonts, some of which aren't really even letters, but that doesn't matter. So for example, if you wanted Futura, just type in Futura, there it is, and then you can download all the different versions of this. Now, this is a font family, which means it has different versions of the font within this. From the very lightest, Futura PT Light, Oblique, which is just the same as italics basically, Book, which is your sort of standard weight, medium, demi, heavy, whatever font you go with. It's really helpful if you can find one that has a large family like this and a variety of different versions of it. That just gives you many more options to be able to use the same font for different things in the portfolio and in a document to clarify when you're using one thing versus another and add hierarchy. So unfortunately, Helvetica is actually not, it doesn't, if you Google it, or not Google it, but look for it on Adobe Fonts, they don't have Helvetica. It's probably just too expensive for them. It is probably the one of the few most famous fonts that there is. It's so commonly used. It's known to be the most neutral font, meaning the font doesn't imply a graphical style necessarily, other than neutrality. Futura is supposed to look a little futuristic, maybe. One of my favorites, which of course is not on there as well, is called Neutraface. You may have heard of the architect named Richard Neutra. Well, he had a font that he used on all of his documents, and you can buy that font. This is not free, so I'm not recommending it or anything, but it's a pretty beautiful font and would be a good option if you were considering buying it. But fonts are very expensive, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing this. There may be student discounts or other ways of getting it, but lots of fonts exist. Some architects make fonts sometimes. Anyways, back to this. So Futura, that's an option, but again, Helvetica is not in here. You can look through this. I believe they even make recommendations of some combinations on here, so this website can be pretty useful for that. These are just the featured. They have Japanese fonts, which probably isn't going to be useful for most of you, but they're there. Futuristic fonts. Probably don't use any of these gimmicky ones. That's generally not going to be a good idea. Your font should support the work, but probably shouldn't overtake the work as being more stylized than what you're trying to show. But basically anything you like in here, say you found something, don't ever use Comic Sans also, by the way, just a general rule of thumb. You should never, ever, under any circumstance, use Comic Sans. That's all I'll say on that. So say you did like this guy, for example. All you'd have to do is just basically click the Activate button, and it will appear as an option for you in InDesign and all of the Adobe programs. But again, because I used a font family that has lots of different weights, I can have my heaviest weight for the title that I want you to look at, my secondary weight for the secondary level of information, and my tertiary weight for the sort of body information, which gives a really nice balance to the page. Again, you can combine fonts, but be wary. It is a challenging thing if you don't know what you're doing, and often will look worse than better. Let's see, what else should we talk about? Again, as I mentioned, balancing a page with multiple different things on the page, a few other sort of useful commands. So if you have an image, say this guy, and you want to replace it, Control D will allow you to place a new image, and that could be any image of any sort. So if I go back to, say, assignment, whatever this is again, assignment 3, and just brought in the path image. Oh, it didn't like doing that, but normally it does. I think I had that image locked, which is why. But let's try it again on something that isn't locked. How about this guy? So even though we'll just do Command D and squirrel, and there he is. Now, he looks a little weird because you can see I actually had a fade on images. So I guess we'll talk about that next. So you can fade out images. There's an FX panel up here that you can say add a drop shadow or transparency. So let's do the transparency first. And actually we'll go down to basic feather, or actually we'll do directional feather. So directional feather here, basically we could say the top needs to fade in 0.5 and hit OK. And essentially it fades in that edge. This could be a way to soften images into one another, but I usually only recommend doing it in specific circumstances. So it doesn't look really good here because we have a lot of trees and things that are heading up into that area, and it just kind of looks like they're being arbitrarily faded out. If I did it to this image, it actually might end up looking a little bit better. And the reason being is I have sky at the top. So directional feather is the one you want. So if I did 0.5 here and just hit OK, it actually just kind of looks like the sky is fading out. So that's where it can work decently, but it's definitely something you don't want to rely on too heavily. Again, let's go in and do a drop shadow. So I think drop shadows generally, I'm hit preview, look pretty bad, and I don't recommend them. I'm going to turn off my directional feather so you can see. Usually the default is way too heavy, so I would go to something much lower, say 0.25, or sorry, 25%. And maybe, so the distance here is how far that shadow is away from the object, so the further away or the closer. Generally, again, I don't think it looks particularly great in most cases. There are some specific reasons why you may want to do it, but it is an option. You can also adjust the blur on here. I think it might be this one. Yeah, so essentially I'll move it away again. You can see here that with this size option set to 0, it basically just brings the exact same shape down. So you can see I have a perfect rectangle here that isn't smoothed out. If I do 0.065, it starts blurring the edges, so it looks like a soft shadow. Again, not something I usually recommend. Another thing that I'll often see is, so a box like this that has an image in it, it can have a line weight. So we could put a line weight on it. again, it's not something I personally aesthetically find pleasing, but it is an option. They do exist. Usually I don't like them because in a composition, it doesn't allow images to flow into one another very nicely. But it is something that you can put on images. There may be explicit reasons why you want to from time to time. So that's kind of the basics. Of course, in InDesign, you have some of the functionality of some of the other software. So if you want to just draw out a box that's a giant black box, you can adjust the color of that, make it something else. And of course, I could bring that and put that, send it back. So if I want to have a giant green streak running across my page, I can. I'm not sure that I would want that, but I can do it. At least I'm going to align it to one of my grids. I mean, the composition, that page actually was kind of improved by that green streak. So do what I say, not what I do, or vice versa. This sort of green thing, if I did decide that I liked this, could become a motif for my composition. So I could decide to put it on my master page, just pasting it in and bringing it across. And then it will appear on all of my pages. I think if you're going to have design graphical motifs like this, I in general recommend them to be relatively subtle. You want the images on top to read. You don't necessarily want things like this that are consistent on page to page to be the more dominant image. But I think that's going to cover it. So again, new pages, this button down here that says new page, that'll always do that for you. You can delete pages. One tool I find really useful is the duplicate spread. So say you liked this guy and you wanted to maybe, one thing I often do is when I'm experimenting with a page and I like it, I'll actually just create a copy of it and put it right next to the original. So if I decide that I want to try something, but I'm not fully committed to getting rid of it, I can maybe edit this one and see what happens if I did left align. Now I can see what that looks like, keep the original, and then I could decide maybe I'll get rid of that original one, and now I get to keep that one. So doing iteration like that can be really useful, where you keep the original because then you're more free to try out new options. I guess I'll talk about some text tools real quick. I'll try to end this video soon and probably have to do some more supplemental videos throughout the week, but at least this should get you started. So looking at text, when you have text selected, which I'm just double clicking in to do so, there are more tools to control the text in InDesign than practically any other software. There is this button here, which will make everything into capitals, or this button here that will do the sort of capitalization with capitals also being larger. So you see here, all the letters are capital, but the letters that I had capitalized in sentences, such as Cincinnati and urban here, become larger letters. So it's kind of a weird form of capitalization. So let's see what else. Go in here again. One thing, personal pet peeve of mine, I always turn off hyphenating because I think reading text where PEO and then people on the next line is really obnoxious. So usually the easiest way to do that is just in the text, turn off hyphenate. So this button here will kind of spread out your text more. Usually leave all these defaults if you intend for someone to read them. But for a title, so example, if I were to say I wanted to make a title, I made a new text box for this. I didn't have to, but I did. Align it right above. Let's make that into, say, 18 font, so nice and big. Say I wanted it to match the size of the text box below. I could, if it wasn't quite large enough, say increase the spread between the letters until it gets just wide enough that I'm happy with it. So maybe that. Again, for a title, that may be okay. May not be something you'd want to do with body text because it becomes more difficult to read. As a general rule of thumb, when creating body text like this, which is any sort of multiple sentences in a row, it's a good general goal to not have too many lines on the same in the same page. Too many words in a single line. I think the general rule of thumb is around 8 is the optimum. At that point, your eye doesn't get tired looking at it. So this might actually be a little bit too many. But especially if you were to, say, spread this out across the entire page, it's just a little bit less pleasant to read. Not necessarily a hard and fast rule, but one to keep in mind. So some other things here, of course, since this is a title, I could make it maybe medium or something else. What else can I do with it? What is this? So this guy here, which I'll adjust in body text, is essentially space between lines. I'm just going to leave that at auto. There may be times we adjust that, but that's what that is. Of course, you have center, left justified, right justified, and then center justified where it spreads out to fill the text box. Center justified and right justified where it fills out the text box. These down here usually make for more visually pleasing compositions because your text boxes are exactly fitting to rectangles, as opposed to having what's often referred to as the ragged edge, which is that line that you see on the right here of text moving in and out. However, it's much more legible to allow the text to have the ragged edge because the spacing has been specifically set up for each font for your eye to follow. And if you adjust that by doing one of these versions down here where the spacing between words is not consistent, it's actually very difficult to read any amount of text that looks like this. So I generally don't recommend doing it. Just sort of manage your ragged edges as best as possible and do what you can there. Okay, I think that's going to cover most things, but I've said that before. So you have two arrows. There's a white arrow here. This actually just does control points. So if I wanted my text box to, say, not be a normal shape, I could do that. And then my text will just kind of follow in. Could look interesting. The same thing can be done for these images. So if I want to, I'm going to click on actually the image first, or the box. So if I wanted to, I could select just one point and make an image that looks like that instead. Again, there may be explicit reasons why you'd want to do that, but I can't think of any right now, for me at least. So that's sort of the difference. The black arrow or the V tool is your standard selection and just move things around. The white arrow will do control points, which allows you to manipulate boxes, images, text boxes, whatever it may be. Yeah, I think that's going to cover it for today. Again, I'll have supplementals for this. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. If you have questions, please let your GAs know or let me know, and I will try to include whatever I can in the next set of videos. And that's it for today. Thanks.